Okay, simple summary this week. I want to talk about an individual, and that person's name is John Quincy Adams. This is not to be confused with John Adams, who was the second president of the United States. This is his son, John Quincy, who became the sixth president of the United States. And I know that sounds like, Nepo baby or whatever. But actually, John Quincy Adams was arguably better qualified to become president than, I'd say out of the 47 of them, 42, 43 of them, he was more qualified. It doesn't mean he was a successful president. He wasn't. But he, I think, pursued the right things. Here's what I mean by that. So yes, when he was a young man, he was given the job of ambassador to a foreign country by President Washington. I wouldn't say it was as a favor to John Adams, but it didn't hurt that his father was vice president. He was actually quite well qualified because he had traveled with his father and worked with his father so much in foreign affairs, and was a private secretary at the age of 16. I mean, he did a lot of things as a young person, and so being given that first job as ambassador, not really a surprise and not really a leap, except that he was young. And over the years, he served in other roles. He served as ambassador to other countries, getting more and more important as the older he got. And he served in the Senate briefly, and he was very well qualified to become Secretary of State, which is the top foreign policy job in the government. And so when James Monroe became president after Madison, John Quincy Adams became Secretary of State, so the leading foreign policy official in the government, and he was qualified to do that. So in your SMART book this week, you'll read about the election of 1824, and this is where Adams's reputation begins to take a hit. Because the election of 1824, I don't want to compare it. There are some obvious parallels to a few modern elections that I'll let you figure out on your own, because I don't want to talk about modern politics. I am not here to create Democrats or Republicans. I'm just not. So that election of 1824, there was a very popular candidate who was an unconventional candidate, and his name was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was a war hero. He had been the general that defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. He was very popular for something that now we kind of look down on, which is the way he had fought against Native American tribes who were resisting, the expansion of the American government onto their land. So he was a hero. Now, I don't know that necessarily qualifies you to be president, but that's who a lot of people wanted. And there were other candidates. Henry Clay was not going to win that election, but also was a very qualified person. There was another person who I'll leave out for simplicity. And then the fourth major candidate was John Quincy Adams. And he's sort of the obvious person because he'd been Secretary of State, which was at the time a really good gateway to becoming president. Now, he wasn't part of the dynasty, the Virginia dynasty of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, right? All from Virginia, and Monroe for that matter. The only person outside of that Virginia dynasty to become president was his father. So he still made a lot of sense. So when the votes were counted, nobody had enough to win. They were split among several candidates, and a couple people get eliminated, and it basically is going to come down to Adams and Jackson. So here's what Andrew Jackson thinks happened. He thinks that Adams, or he thought, because, he's dead. He thought that that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had made what he called a corrupt bargain, where Clay would support Adams to become president, even though he didn't get the most votes. And in exchange, Adams would give Clay the job of Secretary of State, which was, right, as we know, as I've just said, gateway to being president in the future. That's what Andrew Jackson thought, because when the vote went to the House of Representatives to choose the next president, Henry Clay supported Adams. Adams was elected over Jackson, even though Jackson had more votes. And so Jackson cried foul and says, corrupt, and started essentially running for president in 1828, the next day. Here's the problem with that. First of all, there's no evidence of that. And second, how can I put this? Of course, Henry Clay was going to support John Quincy Adams in that election. They agreed on everything. This wasn't about Andrew Jackson. These guys agreed on the issues. If Clay wasn't running and had never run for president and was going to vote for somebody to be president because he thought that guy's going to do what I want, it would have been John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams did not trade the office of Secretary of State for that support. If John Quincy Adams was elected president, and he was, and there was no controversy, and he looked around and said, who should be my Secretary of State? Henry Clay would have been on everybody's list. So there really wasn't any scandal there. There was a lot of smoke, but no fire. However, it didn't matter because that's what people believed. And so from the moment that Adams became president in March of 1825, he couldn't get anything done. He had a lot of good ideas. He wanted to build canals and bridges and roadways and have a national university. He had all this good stuff. But the circumstances of his election overshadowed everything. And so he spent 4 years in the White House not really getting very much done. And Andrew Jackson, as I said, basically started running for president right away. And so the 1828 election, we don't have to talk about it much. Suffice it to say, Jackson won, and he won easily. It was a landslide. And Adams was turned out of the White House. Now, typically, I know this is different now because of recent events over the last few years, but typically, when a person loses a presidential election, especially if they're a president, they kind of go away. You don't really hear from them again. Jimmy Carter never ran for office again. George Bush never ran for office again. Herbert Hoover never ran for office again. When you lose a presidential election, it's kind of the end of your political career in most cases. But the first person to go back on that and not accept that was not anybody recent. It was actually John Quincy Adams. Yes, he went back to Massachusetts for a while, but pretty soon he was elected to Congress and he came back to Washington. Imagine that. You had been president and now you are one of the 435 members of the House of Representatives. That seems to me to be an indication that you are willing to serve, right? You're not there for your ego. If you've been in the White House and now you're willing to be one of several hundred people, to me, that says this guy just wants to get some things done. And he did. And to his credit, for the next, I don't remember the exact number of years, and I'm not going to ask you to have the exact thing, but I want to say something like 17 years of his life, he remained in Congress. And he became the conscience of that Congress in this sense. The thing that he spent the most time on in the remainder of his life was arguing against slavery. And there really isn't any higher moral ground that a person can take, especially at that time. Even people who were theoretically against slavery were always softening their stance and saying, look, I'm not trying to get rid of it. I'm just saying we should limit it here or we should limit it there. No, Adams was like, it's an evil, which, by the way, it was. And because he had been president and he had lived that ambition, and he just felt free to say what he really thought. The people of Massachusetts were going to continue to reelect him, and they did. and he stayed there for the rest of his life. He actually got sick in, I want to say 1848, and died in the Capitol. But that last 17 years is a pretty good closing act, right? That's what all the politicians, now back then it was the Democratic Republicans, and then it was kind of one party, and then the Democrats are one, and then there was the Whigs. So it's not as clear as Democratic Republican now. But one of the common things then that is the same as now is politicians will say one thing to get elected and then do something else when they get in office. Democrats, Republicans, everybody. And that's really what's, I think, to be admired about John Quincy Adams, is that he was unafraid to lose an election. He did what he thought was right. And in this case, where he's crusading against slavery, he was right. So we're going to get more into Jackson and Jacksonian democracy and that sort of thing later, but I wanted you to understand this connective piece. So, all right, that's it. Write this up. Use your own words. Do not AI this. Put it in a Word document. Answer the questions. All right.